Hi, I'm Luke Mitchell. In today's video we'll be talking about the Second World War, specifically the Second World War through the lens of the Call of Duty franchise, 2003's Call of Duty, 2008's World at War, and 2017's World War II. All three have pretty interesting differences in how they handle themes of war as well as different mechanical rhythms. Let's have a look, shall we? In 2003, gamers could shoot Nazis in about 100 different ways. The Medal of Honor series alone had 6 games and expansions by 2003, covering almost every theatre of war that you could care to mention, and even some that are overlooked by most interactive media featuring the conflict. Wolfenstein, the Battlefield series, Day of Defeat, all were established series in their own right when Call of Duty came along. In his review for GameSpot, Greg Kasavin refers to Call of Duty's, quote, authentic presentation, and it is this attitude that Call of Duty takes to its subject matter that marked 2003 as the year the World War II shooter crown passed from the Medal of Honor series forever. In any World War II shooter that came before Call of Duty, the player is pretty much a one-man army. In Call of Duty, they are a cog in a machine, at least in the first title in the series. Allied Assault from the Medal of Honor series and released 18 months earlier very much centres the player, out front, alone, working independently to bring down the Nazi war machine single-handed. Call of Duty tips you out of a boat outside Stalingrad, gives you 5 bullets and tells you to follow a guy with a rifle until he dies. The Russian campaign is Call of Duty's entire thesis boiled down to a fine powder that drifts like gentle dust onto the meat grinder that was the Eastern Front in September 1942. The opening level draws inspiration from Enemy at the Gates, a nod to war media that the series will continue to make, from aesthetic choices to directly mimicking episodes from film and television. You are in a boat, shivering and afraid, with scores of your fellow conscripts. Commissars stand about you, wielding submachine guns. Not one step backwards, you are told. There will be no mercy for defeatists, cowards or traitors. It was a canny choice for Infinity Ward to introduce the Soviet campaign as the last of the three because it throws into sharp relief the beliefs and values of the soldiers that the first two focus on. Until this point you have been fighting in a justified war against a recognisable enemy. Call of Duty doesn't need to explicitly explain this because, of course, we are all familiar with the Second World War, its context and its history. The Germans aren't characterised beyond the odd Schnell or Amerikaner thrown in at odd points because they have characterised themselves through history, and this has been adopted, reframed, interrogated by every serious piece of war media ever since. In the American and British campaigns, the German soldiers, often explicitly framed as Nazi soldiers, are targets. It's nothing personal, and the explicit repeated use of Nazi imagery makes it perfectly clear that the avatars you are shooting are in some way other to the ancestors of the German people living today. The British and American campaigns are infused with a quite genuinely quaint earnestness and belief that what is happening is in general a force for good. Before each level is a piece of themed text giving some broad contextualisation for what the player is about to jump into. In the American campaign this comes in the form of diary entries. In 3 hours I will be in Normandy, reads one. Roual quite eager to be in France, reads another. The British campaign is focused on Captain Price and generally deals with operations behind enemy lines. In place of the more intimate diary entry, we have a detailed mission outline describing objectives, enemy strengths, routes of attack, etc. The war is a job, one that requires rigorous planning and quick thinking. If the British and American campaigns emphasise the right of the war, for want of a better word, leaning towards teamwork and cooperation, the Russian campaign is exactly the opposite. The contrast is thrown into relief by the shocking, bald lack of everything that has seemingly driven the player in the first 2/3 of the game. In the Russian campaign, the German soldiers aren't your enemy. You see the Russian commissars shooting your comrades long before you face down any German guns. You are surrounded by other terrified conscripts in the first Stalingrad level, but it's really the first time you are truly alone in Call of Duty. One man has the rifle, one man has bullets. The second man waits until the man with the rifle is killed. After the first Russian level, the gameplay largely returns to what is seen throughout the rest of the game. You fight alongside other soldiers, but the opening level frames that relationship in fundamentally different ways to the other two campaigns. The Russian story is really one that constructs the player as an insignificant wheel in the great machine of the Red Army, and one that can quite easily be discarded if it means the continued operation of that machine as it minces its way across Eastern Europe. The Russian campaign turns Call of Duty from a perfectly good, perhaps even excellent war shooter to perhaps the first significant piece of anti-war interactive media in the history of the medium. The Russian campaign shows the debilitating effect of war across humanity, not just on the enemy, but on the player's supposed allies as well. In the level where you fight through the sewers, you can hear a German voice being broadcast over the city. "Comrades of the Soviet Union," he says, "the German people are not your enemy. If you surrender, you will be treated well." I couldn't help but be tempted to believe him. Even the small chance of hot food would surely have been enough to shake the most grizzled of soldiers' resolve. Of course, this is still Call of Duty, albeit a proto-version of the lumbering behemoth we see today, so progress remains ever onwards into the German guns. The game ends with the hammer and sickle being flown over the Reichstag. An anonymous soldier bears it, but it could as easily be any soldier, such as the expendability and disposability of human life in that conflict. It is a muted moment, Pyrrhic in tone, hollowed by the cost paid in blood by the soldiers that brought it to pass. If Call of Duty was the franchise's first anti-war statement, World at War, Treyarch's first Call of Duty title for the PC, marks the franchise's high point in terms of pro-war jingoistic mission statements. If Call of Duty aims towards a form of interactive documentary making, World at War is a Kid Rock music video with dancing girls set against a 10-story high Star-Spangled Banner. An interesting shift? Let's have a look, shall we? Call of Duty, for the most part, frames as German soldiers in entirely neutral terms. They are vacuums into which the player is invited to pour whatever justification they see fit for shooting them. As far as Call of Duty the game is concerned when it comes to the Germans, it's nothing personal. World at War, conversely, wants you to burn them. Burn them all. Burn the Japs out of their holes, burn the Germans out of their bunkers, and keep burning them until the bodies stop twitching and their agonised screams have subsided into frothing gurgles. Fire is such a pervasive element in World at War that it is tempting to think about it in terms of theme, but this would be to attribute intellectual heft to work that simply doesn't deserve it. Fire is a mechanic in World at War, facilitating an interpretation of the word realism that the original Call of Duty just wouldn't recognise. Call of Duty understands realistic to be historically accurate, explaining its reenactment of the Battle of Pegasus Bridge in the British campaign, Pavlov's house in Russian campaign, and the silencing of artillery in the American campaign. World at War's realism limits itself to rendering as accurately as possible the movements of a body after they have been set alight by an M2 flamethrower. The first time the player encounters the Japanese and German enemies respectfully, an American soldier has a cigarette put out in his eye and his throat cut, and injured Russian soldiers are executed in a corpse-laden town square. Where Call of Duty was endearingly coy, World at War is direct. Kill these people. Kill them all because they deserve it. World at War's explicit characterization of the Japanese and German soldiers goes hand in hand with a shift in the way that the game characterizes the player character. The viscerality of the atrocities, very deliberately and consciously so, frame the Second World War as an opportunity for revenge on those who have wronged you, and by extension, your country. And I'm going to make a guess here, I can't imagine that this game sold well in Japan. It is up to the player to punish the evil Japs, the godless Krauts, for their unforgivable acts. Call of Duty was about soldiers working together to get a job done and go home. World at War is about the capital P player, how important they are, and how vindicated they are in their pursuit of killing as many wicked digital foreigners as they can. World at War explicitly references its own driving thesis of player construction at the close of the Russian campaign. You fight your way through the Reichstag in an infinitely more detailed and infinitely more difficult restaging of the storming of the Reichstag from the first game. In the game, the player reaches the top and looks over a destroyed Berlin, the red flag being borne by one of their fellow soldiers. Well, for World at War, this detail just won't do. This game is all about the player and how important they are, remember? The flag bearer is killed and it is up to the player to take it up. They advance, but one final German soldier appears, wounding them. Reznov leaps into the frame, wielding a machete of all things, and cuts the German down. Reznov helps the player up. "You can make it, my friend," he says. "You always survive. As long as you live, the heart of this army can never be broken." A brief piece of documentary footage rolls, President Truman announcing the end of the war in the West, unconsciously but inextricably linking the player's actions with the end of the most destructive conflict of the 20th century. Well done, Player 1. World at War's celebration of the player represents happily the high point of the franchise's pro-war bloodthirsty jingoism. The final images are of the Enola Gay and the atomic bomb, and I almost guarantee there was a meeting at Treyarch where they considered a level where the player drops the bomb over Hiroshima. Such is the player-centric thesis of their game design. We were spared that. The final game, from Sledgehammer Games, takes the franchise in yet another direction, different from either of the games we've looked at so far. World War II moves away from any overt or even covert condemnation of war, choosing instead to focus on a much more personal, more generic story of heroism, brothers-in-arms and sacrifice. The themes are narrower, the scope is not nearly so wide or sweeping as any of the previous titles in the series, World War II themed or not. The story follows a handful of soldiers in the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, as they come ashore at Omaha, fight through northern France into the Ardennes before seizing the bridge of Remagen in 1945. A great deal of it focuses on the relationships between the soldiers and how the war changes them, ostensibly. The war itself takes a back seat, narratively speaking, providing more of a backdrop for the human drama that drives the story. It is the most consciously cinematic style the series has seen, utilising pre-rendered cutscenes for the story stuff, keeping the in-engine work to show off the really quite gorgeously rendered environments. What I wasn't expecting from World War II, however, were new mechanics, and not only that, mechanics that directly reinforce the themes and narrative drive of the game itself. Soldiers will be wounded in battle and the player can drag them into cover. Killing enemies unlocks special abilities from the player's squad mates, ranging from providing supplies such as ammo or grenades, to completely new mechanics. Pearson's upgrade, when used, spots enemies on the battlefield, highlighting them on the player's HUD. Time can be slowed down using this ability, meaning enemies can be picked off in quick succession. The entire health system is new to the series. Health packs are back, making a return after being last seen in the first Call of Duty game. They are stored, however, instead of being used instantly, in a system similar to Bioshock's, and this itself changes up the flows and rhythms of combat from both of the games we've already discussed in this video. Someone should really make a video about that. For my part, it is my favourite health system, a compromise between the instant health of Call of Duty and the regenerating health of World at War. Health takes a few seconds to be returned and you are vulnerable while it is recharging, so taking cover is advised, in a system that is weirdly similar to the Dark Souls series, and I didn't think I would be making that comparison in this video. It is also the most, quote, realistic approach to health regeneration in the entire series, which is emblematic of the greater shift towards fidelity and realism that World War II is skewing towards, despite the somewhat jarring arcadeness of some of the new mechanics that it introduces. I mean, that spotting system and the slow motion reminds me so much of Enter the Matrix that it makes my head spin. The greater narrative focus of World War II, particularly the use of pre-rendered cutscenes, has the effect of essentially removing any emotional heft from the gameplay itself, however. By explicitly tying the cast of characters to mechanics, World War II removes any peril. Zussman is never in any risk of being killed because how else are you going to fill up the power bar to earn more medkits? Turning characters into mechanics neutralises their status as characters. World War II clearly loves its characters, Aiello, Pearson, Stiles, Turner, and spends a lot of time, certainly more than in any other title in the series, attempting to round them out into something more than the sketches we usually get in these games. Yet I never felt for a second any fear that they would be removed from the story. It is a challenge that video games, particularly World War II shooters, struggle to handle in any way satisfactorily. Brothers-in-Arms, arguably World War II's closest peer in terms of what both games are trying to do with their narratives, handles this by temporarily incapacitating the characters when they have taken too much damage on the battlefield. They are not killed, they just roll around on the floor for the remainder of the level, unable to contribute any further. In the next scene, the next piece of story, they return. Injury? What injury? The player is mechanically punished as opposed to emotionally. The comparison of the two games is not even really a fair one because the Brothers-in-Arms games are squad shooters, the player being in charge of moving their teams tactically, using cover and suppressing the enemy to triumph. Losing teammates is more specifically tied to the player's skill and, certainly when I am playing, easily remedied with a reload. World War II is also the first in this loose trio of games to actually try to tell an actual story. World War II as characters, a voiced protagonist, story arcs, a villains, redemption arcs, backstory, all things the grand sum of which is what AAA gaming in 2019 purports to be striving towards. World War II goes too far in this direction. World War II is about these particular characters, their own mythic story, while Call of Duty the franchise at its best is about the common soldier, the anonymous sacrifices in pursuit of home and peace. The player character Red Daniels' story is distractingly framed against a hunting expedition with his brother, while another character, Sergeant Pearson, has a mysterious past wrapped up in the Battle of Kasserine Pass, an actual historical event in the Big Red One's history, but one that is only ever referred to by the plot. Pearson's is a story that certainly has dramatic and thematic weight, and is maybe the most detailed examination of brotherhood, redemption, regret, trauma, in this most self-consciously sober and reflective title in this series, but Pearson's developed as either handled off-screen or in the cutscenes. World War II forgets the mechanical lessons of the first Call of Duty game and completely forsakes that storytelling tools that makes it unique as a medium by placing almost all of its thematic and emotional heft in the parts of the game where the player steps away from their primary role and into their secondary role as a viewer. Call of Duty is one of the largest entertainment franchises on the planet, and while World War II's broad narrative drive centres on the actions, historical or otherwise, of the Big Red One, the game doesn't fail to include the untold stories of the conflict within that broad sweep. The liberation of Paris and the heroics of the French resistance, albeit a resistance aided by Daniels and his American colleagues. The story of African American soldiers is touched upon briefly in the Battle of the Bulge levels, a detail of the war in Europe that not even the otherwise peerless band of brothers engages with. Civilian refugees in war zones, and let us not forget the Holocaust are touched upon in World War II also, and this last one in particular represents a theme that video games have historically shied away from engaging with. It features as part of a late-game subplot involving Zussman and his capture, and is sadly underdeveloped, feeling more a victim of a lack of time or resources than any properly executed exploration of the horrors visited upon the Jewish people, as well as other minority populations by the Nazis in the mid-part of the 20th century. Watching this video, it is impossible to overlook the most evident change in the medium over the last 15 years. What I haven't touched upon until this point is how the principal platform that the Call of Duty franchise is consumed on has shifted over the same period of time and the relationship between the two. The first Call of Duty was released for Windows, Mac OS and N-Gage. World at War, 5 years later, was released for Windows, PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, the console version selling just shy of 2 million copies in the first month. World War II was released for PlayStation 4, Xbox One and Windows, making $1 billion within the first month, with a total of 20 million players on console in January 2018 and only 900,000 players on PC. Call of Duty was a PC game, first and foremost. Today, the Call of Duty franchise is consumed primarily on consoles. With that shift comes a greater emphasis on graphical fidelity as the only real driver of the selling power of today's consoles, beyond exclusives and whether a particular person has already chosen their hill to die on the console war in 2019, is how many frames and pixels the little black boxes can throw at the screen. The power of the next Xbox, the next PlayStation, will not be measured by the way their games can bring new experiences to players using mechanics, but by the way those experiences can be delivered using visuals, using sound, even force feedback through the controllers in the player's hands. Those new experiences may well be breathtaking, immersive, all the buzzwords that Microsoft, Sony, Infinity Ward and Treyarch like to use. But they will be experiences enjoyed mainly through the eyes and through the ears rather than through the hands and the problem-solving minds of players, a system that, frankly, bypasses everything that makes our medium so unique in the first place. Thanks for watching.